All right, let's see if we are up and running. Okay, I think we are there and we are up and running. Okay, so hi everybody. In this particular lesson, the first of several video lessons that we're going to be doing here at the end of the semester, in this lesson, we're going to focus primarily on the supposed conflict between science and religion. There's a popular view that says science and religion are at each other's throats, so to speak. They're in constant disagreement. They're each denouncing the other and so forth. So we're going to explore that claim a little bit more. We'll look at places in which that claim is maybe somewhat valid and places in which it is certainly less valid. But essentially, the conflict of science and religion. That's the focus of this particular lesson. Now, we're going to be looking at the way that science and religion communicate within that process of having these conflicts. So there are different kinds of communication that are going on here. We want to make sure that we're aware of those and focused in on the types of communication that's going on. That will eventually get us to the question of theory, how people are looking at the world. Because that's what theory is. Theory is basically a guidance for how you are supposed to interpret the data that falls into your lap. That'll be important to us. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more depth and detail as the semester winds down, particularly as it relates, starting here with science, moving on when we get to our next lesson, which we'll focus on some other topics. But as we unfold that, we're going to keep coming back to this question of theory, theory, theory. Okay, so let's get started with memory or memory. Memory is one of the things that I hope we'll get to a little bit later. But we're going to start right now with this idea of science. And to do that, let me get up my whiteboard here for us. And here we go. All right. And here we are. So here's our whiteboard, right? All right. So to get started, then let's remember we're going to do a quick review here, I guess would be the best way to put it. This is hardly our first time that we've talked about the idea of religion and science. And so what have we talked about? Well, first of all, we've talked about essentially the kickoff of science, the rise of science, right? Um, and the rise of science focuses on this period from about 1600 to 1800. Science, even before that, 1600. By the time you get to 1600, science is really, really on a roll. It's starting to pick up its role. By the time you get to 1700, it's doing really well. By the time you get to the 1780s, science is just absolutely all the rage. Okay, so we've talked about the rise of science. We've seen some of the things that were behind that rise of science. We talked about the presence briefly. We talked about the presence of magic in the Renaissance, and this idea that the Renaissance is still very much interested in this idea of the substance and appearance tension, right? We all know by now that there is this supernatural world, this transcendent reality that exists outside of time space. Here's time space, right? Here's the cosmos, the universe as we know it. And outside of that, there is this perfect space. This is the infinite and eternal things that are out there, right? Glowing with the golden light of truth, beauty, and goodness. Okay, those things cast shadows, we know, down here in our world. And they're just little bitty shadows that fall upon our little bitty world of matter. Okay. Renaissance magic is about taking the things that you have around you, stones and metal and anything else that you've got around you, and basically dealing with that in such a way that you can somehow reach through the appearance and contact this infinite and eternal thing that's out here, right? Okay, increasingly what science sees is that regardless of whether there is an infinite and eternal thing, it's possible for us to obtain pretty strict results and to do some pretty amazing stuff if we just don't even think about that infinite and eternal world. If we simply focus exclusively and only on the world around us here and now, the material world, the world of time and space, this cosmos that we've got here, if that and that alone, if that and that alone becomes our focus, then in fact we can do a whole lot and learn a whole lot and improve the world in many, many ways. And so there is an increasing sense that this infinite and eternal realm, we don't have to take it into account when we're trying to do our calculations about the world around us. If you want to know about water, you don't have to try to find the infinite and eternal qualities of waterness. You can just work with the stuff that's right there in front of you, the matter that's right there in front of you. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the rise of science, and we've also talked about the power of science. One of the reasons that science has this enormous success story, um, going down to our own day, is because it is incredibly good at what it does. Okay, it has enormous power. It is, as we have said repeatedly, the unparalleled method, because remember, science is a method. That's what science is. It is a method. What's it a method for? It's a method for exploring the world. It's a method that explores matter. And, matter, energy, time, chance, that sort of stuff. Well, matter, energy, and time. Those are the things that it explores. Okay. It's exploring the material world. Let's say it that way. It's exploring the material world, and it is the method for exploring the material world. And it is incredibly powerful. It is unparalleled. We have never had a method that does what the method of science does. It's kapow. I mean, it's just enormous in terms of what it can do. Why is it so powerful? Well, it's so powerful because it is self-correcting. Okay. It fixes itself. If you make a mistake, that mistake doesn't carry over to the next stage of doing the science. Okay. Um, well, I mean, it may carry over to the next stage, but it doesn't carry over to the next full phase of scientific exploration, because science says something's amiss here, something has gone wrong here. And therefore, it turns its attention to fixing that. And that's what science does. So science is self-correcting. It is constantly setting itself up as the one, uh, it's constantly setting itself up to check itself. It checks its own work all the time. So as we've said, if you make a mistake in the world of science, how do you fix it? Easy. You just do science. That's all you do. Okay. You just keep doing the science. If you make a mistake, that mistake is going to show up in your scientific process. And somebody's going to say, whoa, why are we here? Where is this coming from? How did this happen? And then they're going to go back and check, and they're going to say, oh, well, because you measured this wrong, or because you applied the wrong calculation here, or you didn't observe this correctly. And we're going to figure that out. Well, we're going to figure that out because the method we have, the scientific method, will show us where those errors are. So science, incredibly powerful. Okay, but then we've also said there are limits to science. So we've talked about the rise of science. We've talked about the power of science. We can also talk about the limits of science. To say that science has limits is to do nothing that would be critical of science. That's not what we're doing at all. But in the rise and in the power of science, we can also talk about the limits of science. And basically, science is limited to answering questions about the material world. The material world is the full and only scope of scientific inquiry. So basically, you have planet Earth and the cosmos and whatever else is out there inside the world of matter and energy. If you've got 1,000 dimensions, if we discover that we don't have a universe, we have a multiverse. Okay, fine, we've got a multiverse. That makes things more complicated, but it's still a world of matter. And that is the issue. Whatever science explores, it is exploring neutrons and protons locked together in some way. It is exploring things that are made of stuff. That's what science does. Its world is the world of nature. Okay. That's what it does. That's what it can do. Can it do anything else? No. There's absolutely nothing else that science is capable of doing. We have said, in fact, that if you boil it down, science can only answer two questions, right? There are two questions that science can answer. And those questions are, one, composition. Let's say A here, composition. And B, reaction. Reaction. There we are. Okay, so composition and reaction, those are the two questions that science is capable of addressing. All right, so we've been introduced now to science. We've reviewed what we've learned about science. We've seen that science basically rose. We've seen that science, one of the reasons it rose so quickly and so thoroughly was because it was incredibly powerful, but that power was limited in its application. It can basically explore the world of nature. Okay, so if that's the limit, and it's that limit that we're going to start with here, and you can probably already see where this is going. If the limits of science are the natural world, so here's what science can explore. Here's the natural world, right? Now, within the natural world, science can explore anything in here, everything in here. It's all well within the world of science. The natural world is just simply absolutely open to science, and no matter what is inside the natural world, we can, in fact, explore it and explain it scientifically. That's what we can do. So that's the world of science, the world of nature. What do we mean by the natural world? Well, let's go back to our first class period. Obviously, the natural world consists of matter, energy, and any interaction between those, any change of state between them. So the world is matter, time, and energy. That's what it is. So when we look at the natural world, we're not looking at something small, and you can't think of just trees and trees and wild animals. That's not exactly what we're dealing with here. What we've got is a world in which the anywhere you've got matter, you've got nature, and nature can be explored with science. Okay, that's what it boils down to. Okay, if this is the realm of science, then we're back again to that first class period where we asked, okay, is this natural world, all time, all matter, all energy, in any possible configuration of those, is that the set of everything that exists? Is everything that exists within the natural world? If so, if your answer to that is yes, then you are what we call a materialist. Meaning you believe that material is all there is. Now, material understood broadly as matter, energy, time, space, that sort of thing. Okay, so you're a materialist, you're a naturalist. Okay, that's one way of looking at the world. Religious people do not look at the world that way. Religious people think that when you have put together this set that you have right here of the natural world, when you have that set in order, basically, here's what happens. You have an impartial and incomplete set. That out here beyond that, you know all this by now, there is something that is bigger. There is something that is more. There is reality that is not material. It doesn't fit into our categories. And this is what religious believers call the supernatural world. If we call this the physical world, as you know, we would call this the metaphysical space. Okay, so that constitutes a different view of the world. The religious person believes that when they are talking about the world they live in, they believe that they are talking about one part of a much larger reality that goes beyond the world of nature. And that larger reality is the world of religion, God, angels, devils, demons, all of the supernatural metaphysical realities that are out there. Okay. Now we can raise a really interesting question. Okay. which is to say that if nature is the realm of science and religious people are making claims about things outside of nature, can science address those? Short answer, no. Of course not. There's no way there's no way to measure this. We've seen this, we've talked about this, we've discussed this briefly, but in this realm out here, in the supernatural world, if it's real, it's not in the reach of the world of science. Why? Well, because science has a boundary. And that boundary in science, oops, I didn't mean to erase that. Stop that. That boundary in science is up here. Okay, it's right here. Here's the boundary in science. I'll get this right in a second. Here's the boundary of science. Okay, the boundary of science is right there, meaning nothing outside of this is the purview of science. Can science conclude that there is nothing out there? No, it can't do that. What it can do is it can say, well, look, I can't find any physical realities that I can't offer physical explanations for. Okay. Anytime I see a material reality in front of me, I can account for how that material reality came to be by looking at the material world. So basically, the materialist is the person who says, in essence, look, I don't need anything outside of the physical world to explain the physical things I see in front of me. Now, can they explain everything? No, of course not. Why? Because science doesn't know everything yet. Okay, but it's working on it. It's working on it. Will they ever get to know everything? Probably not. In the end, you probably will not come to a place where science knows everything because, in all probability, we're going to run out of time. Eventually, I mean, look, there's a time limit on the planet. There's a time limit on each of our lives, but then there's a time limit on the planet too. Eventually, the planet dies. And maybe we'll find some trick for bending time and space and getting off the planet and living somewhere else. But wow, that seems that seems kind of wildly unlikely from the little bits we know about physics right now. So it's quite possible that the human race is going to end at the very latest in a billion years or so when the planet is no longer habitable. Okay, so we're probably not going to have enough time to learn everything about everything. That said, um, the fact that we don't know things doesn't mean that the cause of that thing or the reason that thing is there is because of God, because of the supernatural world. But can science say it is not because of the supernatural world? No, it absolutely cannot do that. Okay, science cannot tell you that there is or is not a God. Why? Because science is limited to this world right here doing its physical stuff. That's the world of science. So if you ask a question outside of nature, then the answer you get from a scientist may be a good answer, it may be a lousy answer, but it's not a scientific answer in the surest sense of the word. Okay, so that brings us to an interesting place, and that interesting place is: does the materialist ever need to invoke God? No. The materialist can always say, yes, I agree. I do not have I don't have an explanation for this. I don't have an answer for this. I don't understand this. But I don't believe that it's God. Okay, that's a perfectly fine place for a religious believer to be. If God is attached inside of nature, and religious people will do this often, and they will do it. I hear it all the time in their apologetics when religious believers are making a case for God. One of the cases they will make, and by my light, certainly one of the weakest cases they would make, is they'll look at something and they will say, "Well, look, science has no way to account for this. God was at work here." Okay, maybe so. Maybe not. But the fact that science cannot account for something does not suggest that God is the cause or God is why that happens. When we talk that way, we're engaged in what we call in our field the God of the gaps. Now, you heard Neil deGrasse Tyson mention this in one of the videos that's in our lesson here on science. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the God of the gaps. He says, if your explanation for things we don't understand in science is, well, God did it, then you're basically doing the God of the gaps. Here's a little gap in our understanding, and so I'm attributing this directly to God. Okay, you can do that, of course, but when you do that, you have to brace yourself for an ever narrowing definition of God, because what we understand gets larger and larger. So we can explain things now that we couldn't explain before. So the God of the gaps, if you're going to make an argument that God exists, the argument that God exists because, oh, look, here's this material phenomena. It is so amazing we couldn't possibly understand it, and therefore God must have done it. Okay, make the case. You can certainly make the case, but it is a case that's it doesn't hold up very well. One of the reasons it doesn't hold up very well is that if you are making a case about the God of the gaps, essentially what you're doing, it's too easy to disarm. Okay, so if you're a religious believer and you want to argue that God exists to a materialist, don't do the God of the gaps, because the response is simply too simple. We used to attribute tides to the gods. Well, we don't attribute tides to the gods anymore. Why? Because we understand the material mechanisms that make tides work. Okay, we used to attribute fruiting to the gods, any kind of fecundity, anything where life appeared, whether it was a human life or the crops in the field or berries in the bush or fruits on the trees. We thought this was God or the gods doing something, a God doing something. We don't attribute those things directly to God anymore. Why? Because we understand the mechanisms of them. So that's the materialist reply. So if you begin to say, well, here's something we don't understand, God is at work, then in that apologetic setting, now remember, apologetics, an exterior form of discourse, rooted in the religious believer's attempt to engage the problem of transcendence within the strategies of intellect. That is to say, the religious believer is trying to present, to give reasons for why their religious belief should be considered. Okay, so if you're doing apologetics, exterior discourse, did I say interior discourse a moment ago? It's exterior discourse. So it's an exterior discourse. It's rooted in intellectual strategies for confronting the religious believer's problem of transcendence. That's apologetics. One way to do that is apologetics, where I'm giving you an account, I'm giving you an argument for the existence of God. Okay, if I'm doing that, it's going to end up being a fairly weak argument. This God of the gaps doesn't hold up because we see so many places where there used to be gaps and there aren't gaps anymore. Okay, so that's one issue that you've got here in the world of science and religion. If religious believers begin to talk to us about this God of the gaps, that doesn't tend to be very helpful. It's not particularly it's not a particularly robust argument to point to things that science has not figured out and say, well, then that's evidence that God is at work here. Usually that's not something that holds up very well. Okay, so the God of the gaps is a pretty weak apologetic argument on the religious believer's side. On the other hand, there is also a tendency among scientific materialists to argue that once they have explained something in a material way, they have exhausted their explanation. So here's a problem that the scientist will often have. When the scientist is communicating, they will often communicate as if the entire explanation of why something happens can be reduced to the mechanisms that make it happen. Okay, let's think about it. We've talked in here about the why-how distinction, right? When we ask, why does it rain? We get the usual answer. Rain happens because water evaporates off of large bodies of water like ponds and lakes in the ocean. It rises. As it rises, it cools. As it cools, it condenses. The water vapor condenses around little bits of dust and other particulate that is in the air. And as it condenses, it gets too heavy to stay in the atmosphere, so it falls back down to the earth as rain. Okay, true enough. But now that you have told me why does it rain, there's the rain falling, right? Little raindrops. Why does it rain? And you've given me this explanation. Then the question is, okay, do you think that explanation accounts for every single part of the process? And if the answer is absolutely, every single part of the process is accounted for here, then you have a sort of scientific equivalent of the God of the gaps, right? My explanation covers everything that could possibly be known about it. Now, that's different. Let's make sure we get this. That's very different from a scientist who says, I don't need anything else to explain how rain falls on the earth. I don't need anything else to explain why it rains. For me, why it rains is perfectly, adequately, completely accounted for inside the explanation for how rain forms. So my material, my mechanical explanation, so this is a mechanical, this is a material explanation. How? Okay, if I can account for everything I need to know, and I'm just not really interested in whether or not there's a divine mind behind this or anything, okay, that's a very different answer from saying, um, I have accounted for why it rains and my account is complete. So science can do this in two different ways. A scientist, let's say it that way, not science. Scientists can do this in two different ways. A scientist might say, look, I know why it rains. Here's why it rains: evaporation, condensation, falling. Okay. And if you ask, okay, does that account for every aspect? A scientist might say, yes, I am a materialist. My explanation covers every aspect of this. Or a scientist might say, well, I mean, it accounts for all the material conditions. I mean, we've got that. I mean, are there other conditions? I don't know. I don't have any science that would allow me to answer that question. So those are two different ways of approaching the question of why does it rain? Okay, one is I can give you the material conditions, and that's all I need to know to work with and get through my life. The other is I can give you the material conditions, and I cannot account for, I can't tell you whether or not that accounts for all the conditions. Obviously, science can't do that, but I don't need any more conditions. So maybe there are other things at work out there in the world when rain falls or when fruits, when apple blossoms turn into apples. But that's just that's not my world, and I'm not interested in it. Okay, so either one of those answers is possible. If you go with the first, I have accounted for why it rains, and my material explanation covers everything. That's rather a weak argument as well. Okay, one can't make that argument. If you say, if the materialist says, I can provide you the material conditions for which about why it rains. I can explain that in the material conditions: evaporation, condensation, falling. Okay, I can give you that, but I don't know whether that's everything or not. Then that's a scientist who's more in line with science. Okay, that's a scientist who's not pretending that their science has excluded all possibilities of other realities. Okay, let me give you another example of this science world here. Okay, so we now have enough knowledge about the way the human brain works that you could take me and you could take my brain right here, and there's my brain inside my skull, and I'm sitting in a room. And I've got my brain is, of course, connected down here to my arm, which is over here. Okay, that's my arm. Okay, no critique on the art. This is brain. I better label these because my artistry is so bad. There's brain. This is arm. Okay, We have enough knowledge of the brain connected to the arm. We have enough knowledge of the brain that we could do the following. We could drape a curtain right here, have it fall over my arm like that. And this curtain would put my hand over here, and I would not be able to see my hand. I would be blind to whether or not my hand is there. Now, let's say that my beloved is sitting over here. Okay, so here's my wife. My beloved is here. No, not my belover, my beloved. Beloved. There we are. So she's sitting over here. Okay. Now they can stick into my brain certain probes, little electric probes into my brain. And if they push a button, I will feel my beloved stroke my arm right there. They can duplicate that experience, right? So let's say we have an experiment. I'm sitting over here on the other side of the curtain. I got my arm sticking through the curtain. My beloved is over here. All right. Periodically, what happens is a light shows up. If it is a red light, like this, then my beloved does nothing. But if it is a blue light, like this, then my beloved will touch my arm. Okay. So if it's blue, my beloved touches my arm. If it's red, she does nothing. Now, if it's red, a scientist is going to push a button, and I'm going to feel my beloved touching my arm. So whether my beloved touches my arm or not, I'm going to feel it, right? So here's the question. When they fire the electrodes in my brain that make me feel my beloved touching my arm, when they fire those electrodes, why do I feel my beloved touching my arm? Or why do I feel someone touching my arm? Wouldn't have to be my beloved, just somebody sitting over there. Okay. Short answer is, well, because science knows the material conditions in which sensation is picked up on the arm, transferred up the nervous system. Here we go. Let's just do it this way. Is transferred up the nervous system and into these various parts of the brain, right? So there it is. So science knows that. So science can duplicate that. Okay, do you understand what that means? That means that even though I can give the material explanation for the phenomena, that material explanation does absolutely nothing to tell me whether or not my beloved is real, whether or not my beloved is actually there, whether or not my beloved is actually touching my arm. So accounting for the material conditions under which something happens doesn't tell us the whole story. It leaves a lot of things that can't be answered, like, is my beloved real? Okay. Well, obviously my beloved is real. But in the in the religious world, this veil that is hung here, okay, our veil that is hung down here, let's again go to a different color here so we don't get too confused. This veil that hangs over my arm, that veil is nature. It's the natural world. I can't see beyond it. I can't get beyond it. And yet, according to religious believers, I have some part of me that is connected to that supernatural world on the other side of the veil. You see what that means? Plato tells us that. Everybody we've read this semester tells us that. There is some part of me, usually my soul, that has some connection, even though my soul lives over here with my body in some kind of connection to my body. My soul and body live over here in the material world. So this is now the material. And my soul and body dwell in the material world, but also some aspect of my soul dwells in the supernatural, the metaphysical world. There's part of me that's on the other side of that veil. And I feel people poking me occasionally. I feel strokes. My beloved is touching my arm over there. Okay. Where's that coming from? The materialist says, that veil that you think is there, it's not a veil. That's the boundary of everything that is. And what's happening is when you feel something on the other side of that veil, when you think you're in contact with the divine, basically what happens is you're getting these little events up here where there are neurons firing in your brain in a certain order, and that creates this experience. And that's all that experience is. It's just a random fire, not exactly random, but a patterned firing of neurons in your brain. So you thought that prayer would you thought you heard God in prayers, or you felt kind of a direction from God, but all that was happening is there were little things in your brain going off up here in a certain order. There isn't a beloved. There's nothing over here. In fact, that whole world, according to the materialists, doesn't exist. It's not there. Okay, so a materialist who says, I can account for your religious feelings by looking at the things that are happening in your brain, that materialist can certainly give a material account of that experience. But can they tell me that having given me a physical account of a certain kind of experience, I don't have any contact with this supernatural world over here, this metaphysical world? No, they can't do that. Okay, a good scientist speaking to you as a scientist will tell you, I don't know whether over here on the other side there is some beloved who is real and is touching you. I don't know that. I don't have any science that can get me there because my science stops right here. That's the border of science for me. I can't go past that. Science ends right there. Okay. So, where religious believers point to spaces in which science doesn't have answers, and they say, see God, that's obviously a very weak argument. We can see it's a weak argument. Most of us don't have any problem recognizing how that is a weak argument and why. We have a little bit more of a problem when we begin to say, okay, when a scientist says, I can explain why this happens, and that's all the explanation that there is, not that that's all the explanation I have access to, but that's all the explanation that there is, that's a weak argument as well. Can we bolster either of these? The God of the gaps, it's hard to bolster. Can you bolster the why argument? Well, to a measure, but that's not it's not exactly where we want to go with our conversation here, okay? I just want you to be aware of the fact that we are in a place where there is this aspect of a distinct world that is at one level natural. Here it is, the natural world. And then there is a different and in a distinct way, a supernatural world. Okay, and those two differences mean something with regard to religion, regardless of how they're handled. Regardless if you get a scientific materialist who argues that answering the mechanisms, telling about the material conditions that make something happen, is exactly the same thing and exhaustive in explaining why it happens. Okay. When I explain, the how, the mechanisms, there we go. When I explain the how, I've explained everything there is to know. Okay, that's quite a claim. Can science back that claim up? No. That claim is the core of scientism. So when we find somebody who does not make a distinction between how and why, and who says that when I give you a how explanation for something, this is how that happened. I've explained everything you need to know about it. That is one of the aspects of scientism, not science. That's an expression of the philosophy that says science, the scientific method, is the only way to obtain understanding. Okay. So the scientific method, the only way to obtain understanding. That's it. What is the source of understanding? The scientific method. That's it. There is no other source of understanding. Scientific method is the only thing that works. Okay. So when someone says, by explaining to you how something happened, evaporation, condensation, falling, I've explained everything there is about it. There is nothing left to be discovered outside of how it happened. Okay, if that's the claim, then we're looking at a little bit of scientism there. And that's something we are going to say, we got to call that. That's just simply a failed argument. Science can't establish philosophical principles. Why? Because philosophical principles are about our relationship to other things. They're not about material processes of observation and measurement and calculation. Well, the materialists would disagree. All thought is simply a process of material reflection. It's just atoms firing in your brain, neurons sending little pulses of energy into different places in your brain. That's all thought is. Okay, that's one way to look at the world. That's one way to look at the world. Oops. To look. Theorein. Theorein. A way of seeing. That theory is something we're going to be back to. But I want to just call your attention to it here. We'll be back to it soon enough. Okay? All right. So let's then step back a little bit from all these detailed processes here that we've taken a look at, and let's see if we can put this into a larger context. Can science tell us about nature? Yes. Can science ever address questions of the supernatural, the metaphysical? No. So what's the conflict between science between science and religion? Where's the conflict supposed to be? We've looked at different perspectives. One perspective, of course, is the God of the gaps, that sort of weak argument that we see over here, the God of the gaps. And that God of the gaps is as we note, not a very good argument. And we've looked at the kind of scientism argument that conflates why and how, that assumes that if you've explained how something happens in a mechanical, material way, then you've explained everything that's important about it. Well, not true. Okay. Though you can explain in a mechanical and material way what is happening in my brain when my beloved holds my hand, I don't think you've accounted for everything that's going on there yet. Okay. Is that a God of the gaps argument? No. You may eventually be able to find all the neuroses or neuroses, maybe. So you may be able to find all the neural pathways that are forming and that are firing, and you may be able to eventually put enough probes in my brain to completely duplicate the way I feel about my beloved. But still, we haven't gotten to the question of whether or not my beloved is real. Okay, so there's an aspect of the argument here that we have to unpack a little bit more closely. Well, we're not going to unpack that. What we're going to do is remind ourselves that in the end, this tension between science and religion, as it's popularly understood, is not very well grounded, neither in the scientific nor in the religious community. The distinctions that we find, the arguments that we find them arguing about tend to be of a different kind of reality. The short answer is, so yeah, let's just say it this way. Let's just be blunt about this. There is no conflict between science and religion. It doesn't exist. It can't exist because both of them are talking about separate realms. Okay, it's like you can't have a conflict between between you can't have a conflict between somebody who thinks that the world is round, and somebody who thinks there is no world. I mean, they're living in different spaces. They're making different. That's a really bad analogy. Scratch that analogy. Um, I don't know another analogy. I mean, because both science and religion are establishing sort of cosmic, overarching claims. The the religious person is making a claim about things that are infinite, eternal, outside of all of our experience of time and space. And the materialist, a person who's a convinced materialist, is making a claim that nature doesn't require any other explanation. Okay, um, you can disagree there, but do you understand how that's not a scientific disagreement, right? I mean, that's a disagreement about whether or not science tells us about everything, or whether science only tells us about matter. Well, we all know science tells us only about matter and energy, but is that all there is to be told about? Is there something else out there? That's the question science has no interest in answering. It can't answer that question, and it doesn't try to. Hats off to the scientist who does not try to do that. So when you hear a scientist like Neil deGrasse Tyson, in the videos that we had for today, or yeah, when you hear a scientist like that talking about religion, they're not talking about religion as a scientist. They're talking about religion as a human being who is also in science. Okay, but science cannot tell us about anything outside of nature. So since the boundary of nature is here, this is the boundary of nature. And since science only explores nature, science cannot take any claim about stuff that's outside the box. It's just not going to be able to do that. So there isn't, in the end, any great conflict. I'm all this to say to you, yeah, the conflict between science and religion, it's kind of made up. It does. It's not. It's just not very real. Okay. It's uh, it's a conflict about two ways of looking at the world. The materialist now, so if we go, so we've looked at these weak ways over here of sort of, two weak ways of approaching the question of how is science and religion related. Let's take a look at one basic, stronger way that is presented. Okay. And so the stronger issue for the religious believer is, if we go here, so the religious believer can ask the question, okay, so you scientists, not even scientists. I know a lot of scientists. Okay, my beloved works with like top of the line scientists. These are top shelf, people in their world, in their field. Um, I think I've told you the guy that was, when she started working there, two doors down, there was she had a colleague, a guy who had like a force within the nucleus of an atom that had been discovered, and it was named after him. Okay, he discovered it, right? They didn't understand why certain parts of the atom didn't fly apart. Well, he was able to explain why that didn't happen, and so it's called the Goni force, if you want to know. And Goni, was two doors down from my beloved when she started working, at her job. Okay, so these are top notch people, and it's fair to say a number of them are religious people. So I don't mean to, I don't, I want to make sure that I'm not implying here that if you're a scientist, obviously you're a materialist. That's absolutely not the case. There are plenty of people who are materialists and they're not scientists, and there are plenty of people who are scientists and they are not materialists. They're not atheists. Um, she has, in her group, worked with a number of people who have, pretty profound religious convictions. Okay, so I want to make sure we don't have any kind of strange, dichotomy set up between, the scientist and the religious person. There are plenty of scientists who are deeply religious. I think, as we mentioned in the previous class, you look at the person who comes up with the Big Bang. He's a Catholic priest. Okay, the first person who does genetic study. He's a Franciscan, friar within Christianity. And on and on and on. Galileo, Copernicus, for crying out loud. These are all people who are either raised in or are members of religious organizations, religious groups, and they stay there their whole lives. Okay, so Enough of this idea that somehow scientists aren't religious people and religious people are never scientists. That's silly. Okay, so there is, however, this real tension that says, okay, so what are we doing here in this world of the connection between nature? So if this is nature, I've made it so dark now that you can't even see it anymore. There's nature. Um, if what's the relationship here? How do we address this tension between the scientific approach, the scientific theory, the scientific way of looking at things, and the religious way of looking at things? How do they address that in a more, let's say, robust way intellectually? Okay, so here's what happens in a more robust way. So if we've said the God of the gaps is a weak argument, here's the religious argument that is probably a good bit stronger, and it is the argument that says, well, okay, is there or is there not um, any cause that does not need a previous cause? And science has to say, well, yes, we don't, or they say no, no, we know of nothing that isn't contingent. Everything we know is contingent. Everything has to be caused by something else, and if it doesn't have that previous cause, it ceases to exist. Simplest answer in the world, if you don't get air, you die. So guess what? You are dependent on, you're contingent. That's what we mean. So in these cases, being is contingent. All right. The trouble with being contingent is that so my me living is contingent upon me getting air. This my mug here, um, continuing to exist as a mug is contingent upon me not dropping it on the floor and breaking it. Wood is contingent. It only stays wood as long as you don't heat it up to a certain temperature. If you heat it up to a certain temperature, it stops being wood and it becomes something else. So we're all dependent on other things to make us who we are. Okay, that's a basic argument. And then the religious believer says, okay, but if all being is contingent, then what is the first being? What's the first cause of something? So you've got to eventually come to some cause that isn't caused by something else. And one of the responses to that is that cause is God. And that gets us to the definition of God that we've tossed out a couple of times in theology. God is the one who causes himself to be himself. So God is his own cause. Whatever you come to at the end of the chain of causality, the religious believer argues, whatever you come to at the end of the chain of causality, is in the end God. That's what we mean by God. That's the supreme being. There it is. The supreme being, the being that is above all other beings, is the one that can cause itself. Okay, so if we say there is something, not nothing, where did it come from? Then we begin to trace back a series of causes. And eventually we come to something that has to be caused without causing anything else. It has to be self-caused. Okay. Now, is that an unanswerable question for the existence of God? No. I mean, the materialist can say, well, that's just a really big form of the God of the gap. You're just saying we don't understand how self-causing can happen in a material condition yet, but maybe someday we will. Okay, maybe, but the very act of being is kind of it fits into then a different philosophical category that makes it a little bit more challenging if I'm going to be just a pure materialist to answer that question. Most materialists will reply to that, will answer that question with some version of there's probably some infinite circle of causes. So there's never any one first cause. Something caused something, and eventually, after billions, maybe trillions of cycles through trillions of different cosmic iterations after cosmos after cosmos after cosmos, universe comes into being, ceases to exist, comes into being, ceases. Eventually, you come back to the first. It starts the process over. So it's basically a set of dominoes in a great circle. So that's one answer. Okay, but at that point, we're asking really bigger, deeper questions. On a day-to-day basis, here we are. That's where we're working. And in the end, if science is telling us about nature, Science isn't telling us about religion, and there isn't really any conflict there. Okay. So we've kind of been working in this class up to this point, um, a little bit, we've been cheating a little bit because we've been acting as if our all of our scientists were materialist non-believers, um, and religious believers were never engaged in science, but that's just simply not the way it works. Um, in truth, the world is one in which nature and religion have very little overlap. Okay. So nature is the realm of science. Science cannot get past nature. So science cannot tell us anything about the supernatural realm, not even whether it's there or not even whether it's real. They couldn't, even if they could duplicate every religious experience that anybody's ever had. Every religious experience that anybody has ever had, in the end, it boils down to some sort of reaction or response within the brain. Could we duplicate that? Well, given what we're learning about the brain, probably eventually we would be able to. Um, that duplication would be, phenomenal, but it wouldn't tell us whether or not the religious experience was completely self-contained or whether it had a cause outside of nature. Okay, on that day-to-day basis, though, um, where do the conflicts of nature and science come? Why do people think they're there? And it's really interesting when we do our surveys, and we go out and we explore this. Here's what we find. We find that about 60, somewhere around 60, maybe even as high as 68% of people assume there is a very stark conflict between science and faith. So that's fascinating because the conflict between science and faith simply it just doesn't really exist. There's nothing about science that challenges religious belief. There's nothing about religious belief, usually, we'll bracket that and be back to it in a second, but there's nothing about religious belief that unmakes science or says you can't believe inside that. I mean, it just isn't there. And yet, almost two-thirds, maybe more than two-thirds of the people we interview and survey, and these are both believers and materialists. Okay, they share the same percentage, about six. Let's split the difference. 65% of them think there is some great conflict between science and faith. Now, if you are a materialist, of course there's a conflict with religious belief. Um, but that's always been the case. That was the case, there were materialists long, long, long before there was any science in the world. I mean, Gorgias is clearly a materialist. We read him early on in the semester. He doesn't think the gods are real. Isocrates doesn't know and doesn't care. I mean, so it's not that these are that somehow science created materialist or atheist views. That's not what happened. Okay. Science didn't invent these. Science did not invent agnosticism, not at all. It was there. It's been there for about as long as we've got records of anybody writing their ideas down. We've got some people who say, "Hey, you know what I see around me? That's all there is. This stuff about the gods, that's full of it." And we have people who say, I see stuff around me and I hear people talk about the gods. I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of this. I don't know how to make sense of my own experiences in life with this. And you have people who are believers at the same time. Um, so these are not categories, the believer, the materialist, the agnostic. These are not categories that showed up after science. Okay. So where does this idea of a conflict between science and faith come from? Science has one way of explaining the world. So basically, what happens is if you are a materialist or an atheist, when you get to science, when you get to science, you have a method that helps you explain all the causes in the world that you can see, because all the causes in the world that you can see are material causes. Okay. If you think back for a moment, you will remember I told you a story about a buddy of mine in the military who claims he was healed by God. He was colorblind. God healed him, according to him, and he can see colors now. Okay. The materialist response to that is very clear. Okay. What happened here? How did this happen? Okay. There's a very clear material response to that. Well, the correct answer is prior to that evening, this man did not have cones and rods in his eyes, not in the right order. Cones and rods are the part of the eye that detect colors and so forth. He didn't have those. He didn't have the right stuff in his eye to see color. After that evening, those structures are present in his eye, so they have spontaneously appeared. Okay, now that's what religious believers call a miracle. Okay, it's what um, materialists would refer to as a mystery. We don't know why, but it is not a freakishly uncommon thing. Okay, there's a term for it in the medical profession: spontaneous resolution. Um, we go in, we find people, they have tumors. We know they have tumors. All the tests say the tumor is there. It's a bad tumor. All the tests say it's a very bad tumor. And then we go and we start to prep to operate, and the tumor is gone. And we don't know why. We don't know how. Spontaneous resolution. It happens. Now, the materialist says, my friend over here who had the miracle of and clearly strange miracle. I mean, miracle is a fine word. Who had the miracle of having colors restored to his sight, having never seen colors before. He saw colors. Okay, that's not something science can answer. Now, do we say, oh, well, okay, so God did that? Well, science is not willing to do that. Science is only going to say to that, well, we don't have an answer for that. We don't have our method for exploring the world, which is our theory about the world, our way of seeing the world. It does not really offer us much in way of explanation on that front. So yeah, we acknowledge mystery there. Do we say therefore it must be God? No. We don't say that because we're materialists and we don't do anything with God. So there we are. We're scientists. We don't do anything with God. Okay, sorry. If you're a materialist, you don't believe that God did it because you don't think there is a God. But a scientist is going to say, well, I mean, maybe God did it. Maybe. Let's take a religious believer at that point. What does a religious physician say about the miracle of my friend seeing colors for the first time in his life after this event where he went out and was prayed for and was, he would say, healed from his color blindness. Okay, so he can see all these colors now. He couldn't before. So what does science say about that? We don't know how that happened, except that before there were no cones and rods. Now the cones and rods are present. He can see colors. What would a religious physician say who confronted that miracle? Answer: there were no cones and rods before. There are cones and rods now. That's exactly what a religious physician would say as a physician. I can offer no other response to this as a physician. That's all I can do. I can tell you those are the conditions. Those conditions have changed. You didn't have cones and rods. You did have a tumor. Now you do have cones and rods. Now you don't have a tumor. Okay. This has been spontaneously resolved. We didn't do anything. It just stopped being a problem. Okay. The religious believer says that God did it. The religious physician says there was no tumor when we did this check, but there was a tumor before. It has spontaneously resolved. That's all the science says, ever. Okay. So the science doesn't say anything else. What would the religious believer who is a physician say about that if you took him out for drinks afterwards? If I took that religious believer who was a physician, let's assume the physician that looked at my friend, whose eyesight was, let us say, miraculously restored, and I took him out for a scotch after he did his examination, and I said to him, "Why did that happen?" He'd say, "Well, as a physician, I can tell you his rods and cones are back in place in his eyes. They weren't there before; they're there now." And if I said, "Okay, but look, I'm buying you a scotch. Be honest with me here. What do you think happened?" That religious believer might very well say, well, I mean, I think God healed him. Okay. Now that's so you see, we've got, do you understand how those are two very different answers, but they're very different appropriate answers? One of them is an answer that is rooted entirely in science, and one of them is an answer rooted in this person's religious belief. What if you're just a materialist? What if you don't have anything but the science? Well, then you stick with the science all the way down. But in the end, this conflict between faith and science is a lot less robust than we have generally been taught to expect. And evidently, it's much less robust than most people think. Because in the end, science describes nature, period. Full stop, new paragraph. Okay, science doesn't do anything else. So when a religious believer makes a claim that they have uh, been in touch with or been touched by the transcendental world, science has nothing to say about that. There's no scientific commentary to be offered. Okay, maybe so. Would you like to know which parts of your brain were firing while you were engaged in deep meditation and felt the presence of God? That we can tell you, because that we know how to do. Was it God doing it? Not our field house. Okay, that we are just, that's this is not our wheelhouse. We can't guide you through that question. Why? Because that's not what science does. Science measures and describes nature. Period. And you're now claiming supernatural. Therefore, not our field. So in the supernatural, essentially, if you've got a good scientist on your hands, let's be perfectly clear here. If you've got a good scientist on your hand, they will not take a stand on the supernatural as a scientist. Now, if you want their personal belief, ask them their personal belief. Go take them out for coffee or a scotch or whatever. Then you can get their personal beliefs. But as a scientist, any scientist who tells you that, as a scientist, I am absolutely convinced there is no God, it's like, well, okay, as a person, you're absolutely convinced, but you made that sound like science is the reason you don't think there's a God. But science can't give you any evidence, pro or con, for whether or not there is a supreme being. So, this conflict between science and faith is largely a conflict that is, how shall we say, uh, it's not necessary. Let's put it that way. It just doesn't seem to actually involve anything real. Okay. So science versus faith. Now, there is one area in which we can talk about science and faith being in disagreement and where they can actually talk to each other. So to be honest, everything we've said above boils down to this. A scientist who is a materialist, who believes that the world is only time, space, matter, energy, that person is certainly capable of holding any convictions they want. Some of them are religious believers, some of them are not. But the scientific method, if a scientist speaks as a scientist, their science does not allow them to draw any conclusions about whether or not there is a supernatural world, or if there is a supernatural world, what quality it has. Okay, whether it is benevolent or whether it is malevolent, we don't know. Science doesn't even know if it exists. Science doesn't care if it exists. That's not science's job. It's like, look, you're a communication studies major. Um, if I ask you some organic chemistry problem right off the top of your head, are you going to have an answer? No. Why? Because nothing in communication studies addresses doing organic chemistry calculations, right? So if you're asked to do an organic chemistry calculation, there is nothing in communication studies to help you. Sorry. Um, that's where science is. If you ask science to tell you, so let's think about it that way. Let's stop thinking about asking scientists. Maybe we should think about it that way. If you ask science to tell you what exists outside of nature, science is going to reply, don't know, can't say, have no way of getting there. So science just doesn't know about the world of faith. Okay. So the larger picture is science and faith, they just simply aren't in disagreement. They can't be in disagreement because they're talking about different things. Okay. All right. Are there places in which science can come into direct conversation with faith? Yes. There are places where science and faith can, in fact, engage in a sort of discourse. And that happens when faith makes claims about nature. Now, just like science can't say anything about the supernatural world with any measure of authority, science as science cannot say anything about the supernatural world. So also religion has very little to say about nature as nature. Okay. But there are times when religious believers step into the world of nature and they make specific claims about the natural world. So let's take a simple example. Um, Religious believers will often claim that certain things happened in history. If you have something that happens, and by happen we mean it's a material reality. Had you been standing there, you would have seen it. You could have seen it, heard it, smelled it, all that. Okay, so Ereignis is that word. Ereignis. That's a German word meaning an event, a happening. Okay, and there is something in theology that is called Ereignisglaube. Glaube is the German word for belief. Ereignisglaube is event belief. So religious believers sometimes make claims that something happened in history, that this is an historical reality. You would have perceived it had you been there. Okay. When a religious person makes a claim of that magnitude, of that sort, that this is an event that took place in history, then that claim is now part of the natural world. Just like if I make a claim that says, Socrates was executed by the Athenian state in 403 BC. I think it was 403, maybe it was 404, but 403 BC. Okay. So let's say I make that claim. I have now made a claim about something that happened in history. Okay. If I say Socrates was a profound prophet of the true God who exists outside of nature, okay, that's a different kind of claim. So the quality of our claims are different. One of them is Ereignisglaube. One of them, I'm asking you to give me event in the, I'm asking you to give me a belief, a pistis. This would be pistis, faith, confidence. Pistis, there it is. Pistis, in the event. I want you to have confidence that the event itself took place. So if I'm telling you Socrates was killed by the Athenian state in 403 BC, okay, now I've made a claim that we can investigate because I've made a claim about something that happened inside of nature in time and space. And if I start making claims about stuff that happened inside nature, inside time and space, okay, those claims we can investigate. Those are wide open. So when you have religious believers making claims about things happening in nature, inside history, in time and space, then those claims are open to investigation. And they're open to investigation like any claim would be open. Okay, now we're in a place where tensions between religion and science might occasionally appear when religion makes claims about the material world. Okay, now most of the claims that religion makes about the material world tend to be of the sort that we have a really hard time uh, proving or disproving with any measure of superior confidence. Take another simple example. Okay, um, when the Israelites are fleeing from Egypt, they come to a place where they're trapped. The Egyptian army's got them cornered against the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts. There's a miraculous moment in which the Red Sea is split down the middle, and the Israelites march across the Red Sea. And then when the Egyptians try to pursue them, the Red Sea collapses and the Egyptian army is destroyed. And the people of Jacob are set free, and then they're on their way. Okay, now that's a story about something that happened in history. That's the claim. The claim is this took place. Now, let's start there. Is the religious believer making a claim that something took place? Or are they telling a story about something in order to build our confidence that God is really present and God will help us in times of trouble? Which are they doing? Depends on who you ask. Some religious believers will insist that was an event, that it took place, that the thing itself was an historic reality. Same thing you get in Christianity. Christianity makes a claim that Jesus, after being killed, he was literally killed by the authorities. That after he was killed, he stopped being dead. That's the Greek. He got over it. He recovered. Okay, he was dead, but then he recovered. He got better. He finished being dead. Is probably the one of the better ways to translate the idea. He just stopped being dead. He just finished being dead. Okay, so he was dead. He was really dead, completely dead. And then he just finished being dead because he did that and he was done with it. And when he was done being dead, he went on to live a new kind of different sort of life. Okay. Christians have made this claim from the beginning, and in our branches of Christianity, we've talked about historic Christianity. Well, in the historic Christianities, that would be in the Orthodox, the Catholic, and in Protestantism, many of the Protestant sects as well. All of these will insist adamantly that the description of this event is not a parable, it's not a metaphor, it's not a fable to inspire us to live in hope even in the face of certain death. That's not what it's doing. That's not their what they're saying is this was an event that took place. Okay, so now they've made a claim that there was a guy, backwater of the Roman Empire, first century on the Christian calendar, and he is killed dead, stops being dead, finishes being dead would be the way to say it. Okay, that's rather a claim. How do we investigate that? Well, we would investigate that. If you want to approach it that way, you investigate it like you investigate any historic claim. How would you investigate a historic claim from long ago? Okay, that's the answer. If an event is claimed, we can that event once a religious believer puts an event on the calendar, right, and claims that this is something that happened in history, then we can turn and we can give that our attention and we can explore it as we would explore any historic event. Okay, so that's open to us. Um, does that bring us into conflict with science? No. It even something as really bizarre as the parting of the Red Sea or the resurrection of Jesus, is that contradictory to science? No, it doesn't contradict science. Does it contradict anything we know about the way certain events take place? Sure, but again, if we go to our theory, if we think in terms of how we're going to see, explain, understand the world, then let's be clear. If your theory involves a God, so if your way of looking at the world is that there is a God out there, okay. So if we follow the what is the ipsum esse argument, that argument that God is being himself. If we follow that argument and we conclude, okay, yeah, there is a first cause, and that first cause is God. God is real, and God is out there in the world. Okay, if you buy into that, and that's a really good argument. If you buy into it, and then if you come to believe that that is the kind of God who would engage in interacting with human beings, then honestly, miracles become kind of moot. Like, if God appeared in history and we killed him, I doubt he'd stay dead. Because that's not the kind of thing God is, right? God is not a being of that sort. Um, so if God appears in history and he's rescuing somebody, maybe he'll do something miraculous. But the point is, God acting in history is, if you believe there's a God, and if you believe this God is the sort of God who loves, then God acting in history is not that big of a pill to swallow in the end. So these are claims that in the theory, in the context, in the pistis, the the conviction, if you are a person of faith, then this is just not that big a deal. These small acts you can take. Is that the way things usually happen? Most religious believers would say absolutely not. This is very rare. This is not the kind of thing that happens very often. Um, but on occasion, God acts. Okay, if God is acting, if God is speaking, if God is doing things in history, then that's open to being investigated. I can do that, but in the end, the event itself can be investigated, but often I can only say, wow, there are certain things here that point in that direction, things that don't point in that direction. So, quick example, if you go back to the resurrection, there was a long time we didn't know, we had no record of Pontius Pilate anywhere outside of if you don't know who Pontius Pilate is, don't worry. He's governor of Judea. He's the guy who sentenced Jesus to death, Roman governor. Okay. And for years, decades, we had no mention of Pontius Pilate anywhere outside of the Christian scriptures that talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. So that raised some questions. How accurate are these texts? How clear are they? Are they how true are they? And then guess what? Well, we found we had a couple of references to Pilate in a couple of other texts, and those led us actually to some excavations. Well, we found coins of his. We found inscriptions that had probably his name on them. So, the evidence suddenly backs that up. The time is right, the place is right, you know. So, okay, well, there's an aspect of the story that looks like it falls into place. Now, does that mean Jesus rose from the dead? No. But it certainly means that the story we're being told here does appear to have that connection to history. Okay. So, but we're never going to get to a place because these are historic events in the past. We're never going to get to a place that we can answer them, are we? Short answer is, well, not too fast. If we're going to conclude that God is real, then the idea that God is acting certainly can appear to make perfect sense within our faith. And if we investigate and we find some historic evidence, well, okay, bully for the religious believer. That sort of backs up a little bit of what they were talking about. Do we find overwhelming evidence of any of these events? Sometimes we do. Sometimes things come through and we're like, oh, well, gosh, that seems like historically this is really on target. Other times it doesn't. Okay. And that's where things get a little dodgy between faith and science. All right. The place that we're going to run into that's the let's say the most challenging is not when religious believers are making claims about events that they want you to embrace. That's not where we're going to have this per se. Where we're going to run into it is when we begin to see claims being made, and these claims begin to center on knowable phenomena. like, for example, in the fundamentalist circles of Christianity. We've talked about the rise of fundamentalism as a sort of reaction to the modern world, how fundamentalism and the evangelical movement, the classical evangelical movement, broke apart in the early 20th century. And the fundamentalists basically took their stand by saying everything that the Bible says is literally true, is literally true. That was the claim. Okay, with that claim, it's it suddenly puts them in a place where there are aspects of what they're saying that we can investigate, and we continually find they're not accurate. So, if I'm going to claim that everything in the Christian Protestant Bible is literally true, then I have to believe that in something like 150 hours or so, there we went from there being no time, no matter, no space, nothing, and then 150 hours later, everything was put in place exactly like it is today, and that this happened not only over a 150-hour period, but it happened roughly, let's say, 8,000 years ago. Okay. Now, like my friend whose miraculous eyes suddenly saw color after this prayer, um, maybe, maybe the world came to be in 150 hours, 8,000 years ago, except here's our problem. The age of the earth, let's start with that one. The age of the earth is something we can investigate. And in fact, when we apply the scientific method to this, we find over and over and over and over again that this just isn't how the world is. Okay. Um, Everything we know about science tells us that the planet is not 8,000 years old. So now what happens? Now we have a science faith conflict. Okay. Now we have a certain realm of believers. Now we have to remember these are a small group within a small group of Christians. Okay, this is not fundamentalism is not the way most Christians see the world, and there are fundamentalists. I keep talking about Christians because we're focused on America now, and that's our cultural heritage. But there are fundamentalist groups within Islam. There are fundamentalist groups within Judaism. There are fundamentalist groups within most religious traditions, in one way or another. So they're Christian. Um, there's the Christian symbol. They're Jewish, um, and there are Islamic uh, um, believers who would in one way or another would all fit under the category of fundamentalists. Okay, but fundamentalists in the Christian tradition. So if we're going to stick with the Christian tradition here, within the Christian tradition, Christian fundamentalists have generally held that the world was made in 150 hours or so, and that it was made about 6,000 to 9,000, maybe 10,000 years ago. So let's say roughly 8,000 years ago. And the trouble is that with these religious believers, we now are confronted with an actual religious faith science conflict. So faith and science are now in conflict. Okay. So let's be sure we're clear here. We've come a long way, right? We started up here. There's not really a possibility at this point where faith and science can really come into direct conflict. I mean, if you're a materialist, you're going to see the world one way. If you're a religious believer, you're going to look at the world a different way. But science as science and religious faith as religious believers, believers as believers, faith as faith, there's just no conflict there in that world. Okay. So, if you're a religious believer in this world up here, essentially science tells you how God did what he did. Okay. How did God make the world? Well, the religious believer says, well, that's a really good question. How did God make the world? Um, and then we turn our attention to science because those are the people who know how to answer those how questions. Okay. Um, we aren't um, disturbed by that as a religious believer. It's the job of science to tell us how all this came to be. Okay, because they're how people. Then we over here in the religious faith, we're why people. Now, why would God be doing it that way? Why would God have made anything at all? Why didn't He just leave Himself to be Himself? What made Him uh, um, create, do things? But science is going to be telling us how God did these things. Within the materialist camp, we're going to be saying, look, you can keep saying that God is that you're trying to understand why God made the world and all, and we leave that to you. You can work on that, but here's what we keep saying. We keep saying I don't. We keep finding causes that can be explained in terms of matter, and I just think matter is all there is. Okay, so those are two different views from within a materialist perspective and from within a religious believer's perspective. Those two views don't necessarily come into conflict, science and faith. The materialist and the believer have conflicts, right? So a materialist and a religious believer disagree about what the world is like. But a scientist and a religious believer have nothing to disagree about, okay? In the general scope of the world up here. So scientist and religious believer, no problem, no conflict. Science and religious believer, no problem, no conflict. Materialist and religious believer, disagreement. They have a disagreement about what reality is like. All right? So there we are. Now that's different when we come down here and we get to this space where we're now talking about fundamentalists. Because fundamentalists are using their sacred texts to tell us this is a more accurate description of how the world works, of the material conditions of reality, because everything in their scriptures has to be taken as literally true. And therefore, the fundamentalist believer has a problem with science. If you're not a fundamentalist religious believer, you have no problem with science. If you are a fundamentalist Christian believer, then you have a problem with science because science will tell you no, the world is not 8,000 years old. Um, it it just can't possibly be 8,000 years old, and we have all the science to show you that it can't be. So there's a conflict now. Where does that conflict come from? The conflict between science and faith comes when religious believers begin making claims about things that are in the natural world. Most religious believers do that, so there is a potential for conflict there. But until I make a claim describing nature, that's where science and faith come into conflict, because science steps in at that point and says, no, describing nature is my domain, not yours. So I can tell you about nature, and then you have to try to understand what I'm telling you about nature in regard to your own worldview and your own faith. But the conflict exists between science and faith only when faith makes, usually out of a fundamentalist claim or a fundamentalist worldview, makes a claim that it gets to describe nature, and its description of nature trumps the scientific description of nature. If the fundamentalist claims that their faith describes nature differently from science, and therefore science is wrong, that's a problem. Okay. And that's a fairly serious problem with a particular kind of religious believer. Okay, so that's a place to stop and catch our breath. Make sure that you get the main ideas here. Science describes nature. Religion makes claims about things outside of nature. So science and religion just don't come into conflict. It's just not there. There is nothing science can do or say that would ever threaten a religious faith, unless that religious faith is a religious faith that is fundamentally built on the idea that my sacred texts get to describe nature more accurately than your scientific method. Okay, at that point, we have all kinds of problems. Then we have serious problems between science and faith. So I hope that clears things up a little bit. It's pretty technical, it's pretty tough, but if you want it in a nutshell, here it is in a nutshell. Science has nothing to say about religion, and religion has nothing to say about science, unless you are in a world of fundamentalism. And then fundamentalism tends to be willing to make claims about the material conditions of nature. And when fundamentalism begins to make those claims, when science investigates them and they're found to be not true, usually the fundamentalists will respond with a measure of fanaticism. That is to say, they'll begin to shift the ground at which things can be called evidence or thoughtful reasoning. And that's something that we're going to look at in a little bit more depth and detail then in another lesson. We'll talk about this power of the fanatical to shape and bend how we're going to approach the world. All right, so we'll take a pause there. All right, welcome back. This is the end, the conclusion of the lesson on the conflict between faith and science. We hit a lot of technical details. We want to start this closeout of that session by making sure we understand some vocabulary, none of which is going to be new to you, but we want to make sure you understand how that vocabulary now is related and the way we've been using it. So we need to make sure that you have in your mind distinctions now between science, scientism, scientists, and materialists. Scientists, materialists, scientism, and science. So you should be able to look at each of those and you should work your way through a definition of what each of those is. And if you work your way through that definition, what you end up with is a pretty good review of our last session, where you can see how, excuse me, where you can see how the conflict between science and religion is pretty thin. If it exists at all in mainstream religious thought, it's really thin. Basically, science is the method of exploring the world. That is to say, the method of describing nature. That's what you do. It's the process of describing nature. That's what science does. Now, is that all that science does? Well, not exactly, no. I mean, after it describes nature, it does things with nature, right? Once it's described nature, once you describe nature with enough detail, you discover you can build a steam engine, right? Once you can build a steam engine, well, then you can build train tracks and trains and eventually cars, and then you can eventually fly a helicopter on Mars, right? So we can do stuff with this description of nature. But what we find is that the focus on nature, natural phenomena, the material world, the physical world, those all mean the same thing. Focusing on that and trying to describe it in great detail gives us a chance to do stuff with the natural world around us. We can make things. We can do a lot of, we can make medicines. We can make technology. It's not just technology, of course. We can make medicines. We can figure out how to build larger, stronger buildings. We can do all kinds of stuff. So science is the method we use to describe nature. And then once we have those descriptions, we can apply them and do stuff. Scientism is different. Scientism is it's a philosophical flaw. It's a flawed argument, basically, that assumes that the scientific method is the only method that teaches us to understand the world, that lets us understand. Okay, so basically, science is the only method to understanding, to reality. Okay, well, that's a problem because, of course, scientism, if you hold that science is the only way you can understand reality, then there's no scientific methodological proof for concluding that science is the only way to just, to arrive at understanding reality. We just don't know that, and there's no scientific way to make it happen. It's like there would be, you can't have a scientific claim that says, Dante Alighieri is a great poet. Okay, there's no scientific claim that will allow us to say that. It just doesn't. It's just a mistake. Okay, it's just it's an attempt to apply one method to a world where that method doesn't exist. In other words, look, if the whole point of science is to describe nature, then obviously science is incapable of saying if there's anything outside of nature, and so then scientism can't function because scientism claims that science is the only method that allows us to understand anything. Okay. Scientism is a problem. Okay. Now, then we have scientists. Okay. Scientists are different. Scientists are those who practice science. That's all. That's all a scientist is. And that's pretty calm and self-contained. No worries there. Okay. So that should be clear. The people who do science. They're scientists. Let's try that again. The ones who do science, they're scientists. Okay. So the ones who do science are scientists. That's what's important. Now, that brings us to materialists. Some scientists are also materialists. Materialists are persons who believe that only nature exists. Only the material world is real. There is no transcendental supernatural world. That's a materialist. So materialists are what we call atheists. That's one way, the term means the same thing. The atheist is the one who says there is no divine realm. There is no supernatural world. It's not there. If we state that in the positive, it's the way of saying the only thing that is real is the material world. And so the atheist and the materialists are the same thing. Now, the important thing here is to note that, yeah, sure, all scientists do science. Some scientists are materialists, but not all of them. You also have religious believers. So religious believers are down here, and guess what? There are some scientists who are also religious believers. Actually, a kind of larger percentage than you might guess. But generally speaking, a scientist can be a materialist, or they might be a religious believer. Now, if we hold these distinctions in mind, that this is a person who is a theist, who thinks, of course, well, you know what a religious believer is. They're theists, and they hold that there is a specific and particular way to worship God, and God is knowable, and so forth. They're not spiritual, but not religious. Religious believers have rituals, they have forms, and so forth. Okay, so you get that. Now, here's the issue. The religious believers and the materialists disagree with each other. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the religious believers and scientists disagree with each other. Religious believers disagree with scientists who are materialists. Religious believers don't disagree with scientists who are religious believers. So if we hold these distinctions in mind, sorry, if we hold these distinctions in mind, then the whole conflict between science and religion, actually, you can see how thin it is. It's suddenly very thin because what you've got is very often people will conflate a scientist who is a materialist with the position of science. And it's not the position of science. Science does not have a position on whether or not there's a God. Science cannot on whether or not there's a God. And any good scientist will tell you that. I was having a conversation with a really good physicist, not my beloved, but a colleague of hers, at one point, and he was trying to explain some aspects of the universe, the expanding universe. And I was talking to him, and I said, I don't understand why, why can't we do this, this, and this? If we know the universe is expanding, why can't you trace that expansion back to figure out where it started? That would be very fascinating. Where was the Big Bang within space, or does that not make sense? And so he was trying to explain it, and he was saying, well, okay, when we say the universe is expanding, think about it this way. We're on the surface of a balloon, and that balloon is being blown up, and it's getting larger and larger and larger. But no matter where you are on the balloon, the surface of that balloon, the surface of that balloon is time space. That's the cosmos. It's expanding. It's getting larger and larger. But he said, no matter where you are on the balloon, every other point of the balloon is moving away from you. So that's where we are. And I said, oh, okay, that's stunning. I get that. But what does that mean? And he said something very fascinating to me, this world-class physicist. He said, meaning, I don't do meaning. I'm a physicist. I describe nature. Meaning is for poets and theologians and for philosophers. Okay. That's a scientist's answer within the realm of science. That's a good scientist being a good scientist. I don't do meaning. I just describe nature. Meaning, I leave to philosophers, theologians, and poets. Notably, he left out rhetoricians. I corrected him on that, but that's another conversation. But the point is, that's a scientist who is being true to science. Science doesn't do anything about meaning. Science cannot tell you how to have a meaningful life. Science cannot tell you whether something is morally right. Science can't do any of that because all science can do is describe material conditions of composition and reaction, and then, of course, apply those. Okay. If we then keep these distinctions in mind, okay, the distinction between science and scientists and scientism and materialists and believers, if we keep these distinct, those categories, those definitions clearly in our mind, then we get to a place where we begin to see how science, in and of itself, right up here, actual real science doesn't have any bone to pick with religious people, because actual real science says, I describe nature. I don't do meaning. I don't do morals. I don't do aesthetics. I don't do any of that. I just describe things that happen in nature. Okay. That's not a thing that a religious believer would have a problem with, particularly in the monotheistic tradition, where God, in the monotheistic tradition, God exists separately from the creation. Okay, so God is not part of nature. He's not somehow, the filling in the gaps of natural matter. He's not in nature. Okay, he's not in nature in the way that you know, uh, if you if you have a painter painting a painting, okay, that human being cannot be inside the painting. Okay, can you paint a human being? Sure, sure. If you can do performance art and that kind of stuff. But if I'm creating a painting out here that is going to exist apart from me, I'm not I can paint a picture of myself in the painting, but I'm not one of the colors in the painting. Okay. In monotheistic thought, God is not inside nature. God is outside nature, and he made nature. And for the religious believer, one of the things that they are tasked with doing in most of the religious traditions, certainly in the monotheistic religious traditions, they're all tasked with understanding, coming to a deeper understanding of God and how God works. Well, guess what? One of the ways that they explore how God works is one of the ways they get to know who God is and how God works is you look at his painting, right? You look at that's the Middle Ages had this same idea. There was the book of nature as well as the book of scripture, and nature taught you about God. Okay, so even if we don't go back to that Platonic world where here's here's Earth, and then out here is the infinite and eternal things, right? Even if we don't go back to that, even if you just say this is a reality that was created by God, that religious believer who believes nature was something created by God, then exploring nature is in some way getting to know God a little bit better. It's part of the process of exercising faith. Okay, so the ideas of science, scientists, and believers, those all go together. The idea of science and scientism, they do not go together. The idea of materialists and scientists and science, those can all go together as well. Okay. So we can see that all of those combinations and all those combinations are valuable and are real. Okay. So we have then more or less resolved our conflict between science and religion. Namely, it's not there. It's only there when we come to that that quality of belief that we tend to call fundamentalism, right? That's where we run into the problem of where there's an actual problem between actual science and actual religious faith. Because in these cases, we have Christian believers who whose faith leads them to say that the Bible is a literal translation, or not translation, is a literal presentation of literal events in every single aspect of its text. So when I open the book of Genesis and I read this beautiful opening poem, there are two poems, by the way. There are two, and if you open the book of Genesis, in Genesis is sacred text in all three of the monotheistic religions. And if you read the first couple of chapters of it, and if you haven't ever done that, then by all means go and do that. It's beautiful. Okay, we are back after a little bit of technical difficulty there. What we were saying is that we're confronting problems with science and religion when we are living in this fundamentalist world. And we were talking about the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis it opens with this. There are two stories of creation in the book of Genesis, two very different stories. The first one opens with a poem that is clearly designed to establish how God is related to everything else. And the emphasis of the poem is that God is the source of everything else. God created everything else. Nothing existed before him. He's the one who caused everything to be. So it's the first is a poem about the relationship of God to everything in nature, and most especially the crown jewel of nature, the human being, according to the poem. The second is not a poem; it's a prose story, and it's a tale, a great telling of the same events. It's the creation story, but they all happen in a very different order, and they're very different things happen. And that's a story that's where the human being actually takes center stage. That in the second telling in the book of Genesis, the human being is told how they relate to nature and especially God. So the first is a poem about how God relates to everything and especially human beings, and the second is a great prose telling of how human beings relate to nature and also to God outside of nature. Okay, so those are the two stories. Now, what happens in fundamentalism is um, a believer who is a fundamentalist has to take these stories, since they believe that everything in the scriptures is literally true. They have to take those stories as telling of events that actually took place in the time frames that they're set in. Okay, when a religious believer does that, when a religious believer takes that first story, then they are faced with a conflict because they now are asking, they're now required to believe something about nature, that is the material world, and the truth of the matter is what they're being asked to believe is something that science can show you is not valid. So that's that position that you would take that the world is 8,000 years old and was made in about 150 hours, that everything in the universe is 8,000 years old and was made in about 150 hours. That simply isn't true. Okay, so scientifically, we can just simply say that's not how the material world is. So what does a believer do? Um, well, there are a couple of ways to deal with that, and how believers deal with it isn't the focus of our conversation here. But the issue is believers deal with it in a variety of ways. Some of them reframe how they think of their sacred texts. Some of them reframe other aspects of their hermeneutics, the way they interpret and read their Bibles. Um, some of them become fanatical. Now, we know we'll review here just very, very briefly. You know the basics of um, fanatical belief, right? We've talked about that. Uh, you've got that down pat. So in the fanatical world, we have conviction, confidence, faith, and we have our own, down here below that even, we have our own, preferences, um, our own desires. And above that, if we're in our little hierarchy, as an aspect of the intellect, we also have things where we have certainty. And those issues of certainty are, as we can now see after the modern world, we have a lot more certainty about the world than we did prior to the modern world. That certainty comes out of the powerful application of the scientific method. But we have said, and from the beginning, it's always been a matter of observation and measurement and calculation. So that's the evidence that leads to certainty. And in conviction, we've always said it's been a matter of thinking clearly about the world, logos, and a matter of training your emotions to respond, pathos, and a matter of listening to people who know more than you do, right? Having the humility to learn from others, ethos. That is the evidence that leads to conviction. And down in preference and desire, it's just preference and desire. It's preference and desire all the way down, right? It just comes out of your genetic makeup, your moods, and so forth. And um, it's what you want. Okay. So as we have discussed, that in acts of fanaticism, what we can see in fanatical processes is that someone will take their convictions and at the last minute they'll derail them and claim that they have certainty because they've got a good case. Or they will take even their desires. I want this to be true. And at the last minute, they'll derail that and say it constitutes evidence. Now, remember, the world of logos, pathos, and ethos, um, it's not the clearest that's ever been written. But in the world of logos, pathos, and ethos, um, you you construct enthymemes, you give reasons that are strong enough that even people who disagree with you have to look at it and say, "Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense." Okay, that's the nature of an enthymeme. Uh, it's a good reason. So the basically the fanatical person will take when a person is acting in a fanatical way, let's put it that way. What they will end up doing is they will end up following this path of building enthymemes, and then they will pretend that their enthymemes got them certainty. They will start with things they want to be true, and they will treat those as if they were reasons, my feelings, my beliefs, what I want to be true, my intense feelings about this is a reason for you to form some kind of conviction. That's not true. Okay, however intensely you feel about anything, that's not a reason for me to take it into account. And likewise, as we've said, what will happen is the fanatic will also take evidence that belongs in one area, and if you're giving it, they'll drop it down to the next. They'll take your enthymemes, and you'll be told, well, that's just your opinion. You'll give them a very good, strong case for something, and you'll be told, well, I mean, sure, you can believe that. I can see how a person would believe that. So that's the process. So what will happen, what we see happening in cases where we are dealing with a fundamentalist faith that is trying to describe nature, we'll see this pattern emerge. And that pattern will be where the religious believer will talk about their own experience and conviction and treat that as if it were a public reason for somebody to draw a conclusion. They will consistently dismantle evidence that challenges them. And this is probably the most telling aspect of fanaticism in the religious world. It's the dismantling of obvious evidence. Now, why can you do that? How can you do that? How do people dismantle evidence that leads to certainty? We'll talk about that a little bit later. I hope we'll get to that a little bit in our closing sessions. But essentially, this is the fundamental, if you will, way that certain religious believers end up with a conflict between their convictions and science. Is that conflict real? Well, it's certainly real for them. That is to say, they experience it as a space in which science is clearly saying something that they cannot embrace because of their religious convictions. Is it a problem within a broader scope? Most religious believers don't find that to be the case. That's just not how it has panned out. Most religious believers look at the way science operates and they're fine with it. Okay. And apart from that fundamentalist world, we 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 come to a place where that there just isn't anything in this science and religion are at each other's throats. So what I would suggest you do is the next time you run into something or someone saying, yeah, science shows that religion isn't true, or even if you get a religious believer who makes a claim that, science has proven that this is true about my faith. Okay, look carefully and remember these categories. Scientists cannot comment on the religious world as scientists. They can only comment on the, supernatural world as average people. Okay. When we think about our readings that were in our science program, you had a couple of issues, a couple of videos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And a couple of those I want to call your attention to. The first one was the longest Neil deGrasse Tyson you had is about, I don't remember exactly how long, about 6-7 minutes, in which Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about religious faith, not his own personal religious faith, but how religious believers feel about science. And in that interview, it was really interesting because he seems to struggle with, he has an intuition about. So if you don't, I mean, surely you know Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you know Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know him. He's an astrophysicist and he's a science popularizer. He tries to teach and present science online and in his seminars and webinars and all. He tries to do that for the popular audience. So he's out there to try and teach science to average people like you and me. So for that reason, let's just stop this. So for that reason, what we end up with is we have a lot of Neil deGrasse Tyson being confronted with this question about, well, what about science and religion? What about science and religion? And he said some horrible things about it. I didn't put up his bad stuff, but early on, he's just got some just ludicrous comments to make. That's okay. People make stupid comments online, and unfortunately, stupid comments online never go away. So they're there, and so Neil deGrasse Tyson has got some pretty horrifying things to say about religious faith and religious people early on in his YouTube career. He mellows out notably in his later years, okay, as he's gone along. And it's very interesting. I find that interview with Bill Moyers particularly interesting. Bill Moyers is, by the way, I think he's a some Protestant pastor. Okay, he's a journalist and a Protestant pastor. I think a Baptist. I'm not sure. Um, but Moyers is interviewing him. The topic isn't particularly religion per se in the interview, but obviously it comes in because Bill Moyers is a curious guy and he's got religious faith, and so he's got this great scientist in front of him. So they're bantering back and forth. And I appreciated in Neil deGrasse Tyson's remarks his attempt to sort of craft some kind of space where some people draw convictions, draw conclusions that he says cautiously, um, there's science isn't ready for that. Science can't do that. Okay, so he's willing to bracket, and this is something he wasn't, and that's the problem early on. Neil deGrasse Tyson early on sounded very much like not just a scientist, but a proponent of scientism. That if you believed something and it wasn't scientific, then you were just kind of an idiot. And so you can't say that very long online without somebody correcting you. And I think Neil deGrasse Tyson's a smart enough guy and maybe even a humane enough guy to learn from his mistakes. So he's kind of backed away from that. But I appreciated that, and I hope you heard that. If you listened to that, if you didn't, like like I say, it's about 6-7 minutes. Go listen to it. Listen to the kinds of spaces that he's trying to make for religious believers. Now, these are people he profoundly disagrees with. He's I think has always been an agnostic. He was very much a sort of convinced borderline atheist, convinced agnostic early on. He softened a little bit. He's like, well, who knows? There's a little bit more of that in him. But then you had two other really, really brief videos, it's a couple of minutes each, in which he addresses this issue of religion in the same way. I mean, in a similar context, somebody's talking to him, or he's giving a presentation, and he talks about religion. And I want to point out that he's working with these categories of that you and I know of knowledge, certainty, conviction, and then preference. And he's kind of doing that, unfortunately, in a very clumsy way. We would say, as rhetoricians, we can critique Neil deGrasse Tyson. I would never critique him as in any way. I can't critique his science, but in terms of his communication skill and his argument, he's dealing with some categories that I think he's kind of intuited and kind of had sort of presented to him by people backstage, right? Bill Moyers and so forth. So Neil deGrasse Tyson eventually runs into really smart people who are also religious believers, and profoundly devoted to their faith. And so he's had to adjust a little bit. Well, a good scientist adjusts in light of new evidence. So he's being a good scientist. But what he's found is, in essence, what I have found watching him over the years is that he doesn't understand conviction very well, but he's got something. He just doesn't understand it. So that's the thing. If he writes us, maybe he'll write our class. Somebody, if you know Neil deGrasse Tyson, tell him to write me, and we'll put together a class letter and send back to him and explain to him the nature of conviction. And I think that would help clarify some of Neil deGrasse Tyson's issues. You also had one other video, two other videos, but one that I want to talk about that was also a brief one, about 3.5 minutes. I think I asked you to watch, of a youth pastor. So a youth pastor, if you don't know what they are, these are individuals who are within a church, and they usually work with the younger people in that church to help them find their way as they transition from basically from childhood from adolescence into adulthood, early adulthood. They work with that group of people to try and grapple with their questions and their problems and address them. I thought he did a pretty fair job, that youth pastor, in saying, look, I believe in science and I also believe in God. What's the problem? So that kind of gets us to a little bit of the categories we were talking about tonight. He doesn't use the term scientism, but he's clearly talking there about how science shouldn't be any source of, it shouldn't frighten a religious believer. There's nothing in science. Okay, look, this is how God made the world and it functions this way. How is that going to scare a religious believer? Okay, so there's that going on there too. So these were all interesting uh, videos and the way people grapple with these territories. Then you got to the final one, which was let's see, what did I ask you on that one? This was about 5 minutes, about 5.5 minutes. And this was the bishop, the clergyman. He's Bishop Barron is his name. He's all over the internet. I mean, yeah, he's everywhere on the internet now. He and Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'd love to see them have a conversation. They're both about a zillion hours of them out there on the internet. But in this one, what he did was he laid out this issue of scientism. And I think that is a particularly clear, clean statement. Yes, a statement by a religious believer, but it's an accurate statement. It's a clear, clean, accurate statement about the problem of scientism. And he lays that out pretty well. So again, if you're working your way around that and you're working your way through those categories we were talking about, and scientism is still a little bit of a mystery to you, then I would say by all means go back and watch the first 5 minutes of that video there with Barron Scientism Science 2012, because that'll help clarify that. Last, you had an article, and this article was kind of a departure and a little weird. And I asked you to read it carefully and thoroughly. And I wanted you to do that because it ties in. Let me see if I do have, I mean, I know I've got it, just if I've got it in reach here. There we are. So it was an article that was, it's why are we doing this article in regard to science? We're doing this article in regard to science because we come here face to face with that issue of when God is acting in the world, what are we supposed to do about that? When God is at work in the world, how is a scholar supposed to approach that? I mean, how do we do that? So we have a group of people. Okay, these are religious folks. They're evangelicals. They tend to be the people that Dane and Cook in the article, the Dane and Cook article. They tend to be toward the Pentecostal, charismatic side of the evangelical world. They're very invested in this idea that God interacts with them personally, and that God will sometimes speak to them. Well, that fits. Okay, so why are we talking about that? So for those of us without religious belief, when we hear someone make the claim God is acting here, whether it is in speech or whether it is in some other material change, we're kind of stuck because the best we can do is describe the phenomena in front of us. That's one of our options. Okay, that's one of our options. If this is sounding a little like the God problem, bingo, this is the God problem. The Dane and Cook article that you were assigned is straight up dealing with the God problem in one particular way. And that's what we want. That's why we're here, because the God problem fits into this question of science, because we're asking, how do we study people who say they're talking to God? How do we study miracles? Okay, so again, back to my army buddy who had the miracle in his life. How do we study that? Well, as we've said, early in the class, we said, well, the early in this lesson, we said, well, okay, here's what science can tell you about that. Science can tell you there weren't the proper structures in his eye to see color. We know that. We have that. It's absolutely true. Now there are the proper structures in his eyes to see color. We know that. We have that. It's absolutely true. That's what science can do. That's what science can tell us. Okay. So the issue that is present then is, okay, I can describe the phenomena. And what Dane and Cook are trying to do is exactly that. They're trying to make that kind of a scientific, in this case, a social scientific application to a claim that God was acting here. God was speaking in this case. So what they did is they went out and they studied a group of people who made the claim that God was speaking to them. Now, here's a couple of interesting places to start. So I'm going to start on page 99 of that text. I mean, the text starts on page 97 or something. So 99 of that text, there are a couple of things I'll call your attention to. So first of all, here's the thing. So in the second indented paragraph on page 99, it says, recently, an international team of social scientists have examined perceived experiences of God and their effect on human benevolence. Okay. And among other things, they found that experiences of interpersonal interaction with God were surprisingly common. Okay. So let's make sure we start with a clear understanding. As a social scientist, now we're rhetoricians in this class, so we're not really social scientists, but we're going to start with the social scientific approach. In social science, they're going out and they're basically bracketing the God problem because they're saying, we're just going to report to you what other people said. Okay, and here's what happens when they go out and they make these inquiries, they discover that there are a lot of people who God talks to, like a lot, scary a lot. Okay, um, if you bracket out, so there are a number of studies, and in fact they cite a study that is also cited in another book, which I will recommend to you very strongly. This one, When God Talks Back, by Lerman. Lerman, T.M. Lerman, she does a study, much longer study, but it's on the same lines as Dane and Cook are doing. And what she does is she does an ethnographic study. She goes in and she lives with a religious community that is a charismatic community. She is not herself a believer. Um, and she went in, transparently saying, look, I'm not in your faith, and I don't expect to be in your faith. I just want to understand how you live your faith. So they welcomed her in and they brought her in, and she lived there for some months. Not in, didn't live inside the building, but she worked there for months and months. And these were people, and she went there because these were people who frequently said God spoke to them. And she was trying, as a social scientist, she wanted to understand how these people, she wanted to describe for us, to tell us how these people described and interpreted that experience. Okay. So so there are people for whom this happens, and a lot of people for whom this happens. Uh, the Lerman studies, she has studies before the book comes out, and she's actually cited in Dane and Cook in a couple of places. But here are some numbers for you that will be interesting. If we go back to the 1890s, the very height of modernism, okay, we go back to the 1890s, what we find when we ask around, we look at the surveys of the time, we find that 8% of the men that were talked to in that period said that God spoke to them. 12% of the women made that claim. 10% of everybody that was surveyed in the 1890s claimed that God had spoken to them. Okay, God had communicated with them, and sometimes had communicated to them verbally. That is to say, they believed that if someone else had been in the room, they would have heard the voice. Often they don't say that. They say, I think this was a voice that no one would have heard but me. But sometimes they claim it's an exterior voice. That's interesting. When we move ahead to more contemporary studies in the early 2000s, well, mid 2000s, 2010 and so forth, we find an interesting mark. That number has increased slightly. 10% of the men and 15% of the women. So men have gone up from 8 to 10, women have gone up from 12 to 15% of them. An average total of 13% of the people say that they believe God has communicated with them. Now, that's an interesting number, 13%. That's more than 1 in 10 of the people you know probably believe that God has talked to them at some point in their life. That's not an overwhelming number, but here's the kicker. When we go in and we adjust the number for qualifiers, in other words, if we go in as a social scientist and we say, okay, here are people who reported this event to us. They told us that God spoke to them, and then they qualified or denied it. Okay, so these are people who said things like, yeah, so I think God was telling me that I had to get out of this relationship, but that was probably just my imagination, yeah, God told me that I was supposed to be, that I was supposed to be an architect. I was wondering and I was thinking about it. And I was stewing on it. I even prayed about it a little bit. God told me I'm supposed to be an architect, but I mean, probably I don't know. Maybe that was just me working it out. So when we go to that, when we go to people who make a claim that said God told me to do something or not to do something, or God spoke to me, God communicated to me. Okay. But then they bracket it and say, but maybe that wasn't what was going on. Maybe it was something else. Okay. We don't include those in the stats you've just heard. Okay, so 13% of the people are saying God spoke to me, full stop. Okay. Now, when we add in the people who said, I had this experience where I thought God was speaking to me. Yeah, but probably not. When we add that in, the number goes up from 15% to about 40%. 40% of people suddenly are in a position where they're claiming that God has spoken to them. Well, that's fascinating. That is fascinating. When we follow Dane and Cook, one of the reasons that we follow Dane and Cook is because they also provide us with some really fascinating material toward interpreting how these experiences work. So if 40% of the people out there are now granted, 40% of the people are out there saying God spoke to me, and more than half of those people that say God spoke to them are also saying, but probably not. Okay. All right. So if we go and we look at those people, when we begin to press them, and particularly when we begin to press those people, those individuals who are not qualifying, they're saying, yeah, God spoke to me. Here's something interesting we find. We find essentially, I'm going to skip over real quickly in the interest of time over to page 109, second to the last paragraph on that page that begins, in some pathological conditions, such as schizophrenia, there is a disturbance in personal agency. It's referred to as thought insertion. While thought ownership remains intact, the standard approach to the core phenomenology of thought insertion characterizes it in terms of a normal sense of thought. Then we get to this. We get to this idea that when they talk about the way this is happening, here's what they tell us. They say, I'm on page 110. In this paper, our main interest has been in how God is understood by a group of evangelical Christians to communicate with his subjects and the role of personal agency in the process. Now, how God is understood, that's the social science way. We're not here to tell you what was going on. We're here to tell you how these people reported their understandings of what went on. Okay? Now, remember, in rhetoric, we know a little bit more of a problem because we have to account for how meaning is happening in communication. So the God problem gets much larger for us, but they're bracketing the God problem by saying we're simply reporting to you what these people reported to us. Here's what they say. The key issue in Dane and Cook is that when these people experience the voice of God, they are experiencing a calling that is taken as invitational, they say. In other words, what happens is they feel invited into a kind of experience or perspective or direction. They do not feel compelled. Across the board, every one of them consistently reports that this is one of the marks. When they go out, they do a lot of things. They go out and they try to. So what happens once you've gotten this communication? We discover they do a lot of things. They think about it in terms of their past experiences. They take it to a pastor or a trusted friend. They think about it in terms of what they have been taught in their faith. So they're doing all the logos, pathos, ethos things. They're building enthymemes about whether or not this is true or good. Okay, you can see that on page 107, 8. They talk about some of these tests that they put it on. Okay, but the thing that keeps coming up and that is consistent throughout the experiences for all those who believe that this was God speaking to them is this retention of agency. That is to say, this is not a voice that makes them do things. Now we saw, and you can read about it in Dane and Cook. Surely you noticed it if you read Dane and Cook. There are kinds of breaks with reality, mental incapacities that lead individuals to feel an absolute compelling need to do something. The voices in their heads say this has to happen, and you don't have any choice about it. That having a choice about it is one of the marks of divine communication. Okay. So one of the marks that keeps coming up, and it comes up in Dane and Cook, and it also comes up in Lerman's study, is this fact that when these people claim God speaks, they consistently report that their own will remained intact. So this retention of agency is a mark of religious reporting of God communicating. So we've talked about God talking to people and how do we know that that's true or not true? How would you sort that out? And we said one of the things is that religious people, go back to Father Lazarus, go back to Chad DeCoven, religious people who hear from God, they tend to remain fairly grounded, pretty well connected with material reality. They're not disconnected from the material world. In other words, they may be non-rational and reach beyond the rational, but they are never irrational. They never contradict reality. Okay. A second thing that happens is now we have this second mark from both Lerman and from Dane and Cook. And that mark is they tend to hold on to agency. They're never compelled. They simply experience these voices that come to them, these directions that come to them as directions, invitations. They're not forced to do things. There's also closing point for people who have these experiences, and this comes from Lerman's study. And one of the things that she points out in her study is essentially she tried to figure out what are people like who hear these voices. Is there some distinction or difference between them and people who are in the same faith, live the same faith, believe the same things, but don't have these experiences? What kind of differences could we see? One of the marked correlations, strong correlation, is in something known as the absorption scale. Don't worry about it. It's a test for essentially how imaginatively and how innocently, in a very technical term, innocently one experiences the world. And people who score high on the absorption scale, it's not a religious test, it's just a psychological test. It's filled with questions like, hey, sometimes I'm listening to music and I forget everything around me, or occasionally I have smells that bring colors to my mind, or there are moments when I look at something in nature and I feel very much like a child who doesn't have words. That those are the kinds of things. So when you're having these experiences, how often are you looking at them and sort of analyzing them and understanding them, and how often are you just lost in them and captured by them? And that's the absorption scale. It's not like if you score high on the absorption scale, you're healthy and happy, and if you score low, you're unhealthy and unhappy. That it doesn't have any of those correlations. But it's just a mark that tells us how people intuitively approach the world. Do they analyze, or do they just dive in and experience? People who dive in and experience, people who are willing to surrender intuitively to the world around them, they tend to be far more likely to report these communication events. And so there seems to be another element here as well that Lerman says. They also tend to be people who have been trained. They've been taught how to engage the spiritual world. They're not on their own. They're not working stuff out. They're not vaguely spiritual and intuitional. They have these deep absorption experiences with the world, but they have also been taught. They have also been trained. They have also been through disciplines that teach them how to pray and how to understand. So Lerman says it this way, and we'll close with this quote from Lerman. It appears then that there really is something like talent and something like training, and that both mattered if someone was going to experience God, this voice of God talking to you. Okay, so that doesn't mean that people who don't experience this voice are, somehow less religious or anything. None of that is what is the implication here. But the implication is that somehow people who tend to hear God speaking to them, they don't tend to be people who break from reality. They're not severed from the ability to interact. They don't deny the rational world. They simply reach beyond it in some way. They retain agency. Okay. They're never forced by these experiences to do anything. 3, they seem to be predisposed at some level by the way they approach the world to having these kinds of experiences. And 4, they seem to be almost always They have been through some disciplines that have taught them prayer, have taught them meditation, have taught them this sort of interactive system of encountering God. So there's a communication event here then that's very, very interesting to us. We will try to take that up a little bit more in our next lessons, but for right now, that's where we are. Okay, so the conflict between science and faith, yeah, don't worry about it. It's not there. Is there a conflict between science and fundamentalism? Yeah, there is. That's true because fundamentalists make claims about nature, and science says, no, that's my domain. And when we have these experiences, the miraculous, where something breaks into the natural world and seems to be an event or a voice, how do we approach that? Well, events, we leave that to science. Science tells us this is what happened. And is God behind it? Well, that's going to be a question of your theory. It's going to be a question of your way of looking at the world. If you're a religious believer, you can say this is a miracle. God did this. And if you are a materialist, you're going to say, don't know yet. We'll figure it out down the road. What we can say from the communication point of view is, however, religious believers who engage in, who have these experiences of communication with God, we're beginning to see a pattern emerge. We'll talk about that pattern a little bit more as we move on to our next lesson. So there's that for now. All the best.